Hello, everyone. We're back with Iser Flaum, who has written the book Under the Wings of My Bubbe, available on Amazon. It's terrific. And then we've just done 2 episodes of storytelling, history telling, quite frankly. And you're listening to the Obligations of Memory podcast for the Jewish Culture and Holocaust Remembrance Group. I'm Jeffrey Geisner, the founder, and I'm thrilled and honored to be listening to these stories that Iser has about his father. And we're going to take this episode really to unearth more of some of the historical stories that Iser was told by his father that pertain to surviving probably 12 camps, the way you've written and spoke about them in the last episode. You'd made a list for us. So let's take it from here. And you indicated that you really wanted to share some really important stories, both with Germans and with others. So why don't you just tick away the stories, and we'll ask questions as you bring them forward.
Sure. Well, as you mentioned, my dad did move around between a good number of camps. And one of the reasons was, one of the first things he learned was to increase your chance of survival, volunteer. Whenever they ask for a volunteer, whenever they ask somebody knows how to do this, somebody knows how to do that, even if you don't know, you lie anyway, and you volunteer. That's how he got moved around as they needed him in different places. So that kept him alive, because that was the main thing he learned as a means of survival was, if you were useful to them and you satisfied a need for them, chances got better for you.
Do you know how they came about and asked for volunteers? Was it?
Well, I'll give you one example.
Please.
Yeah, he's in one camp doing the assorted grunt jobs. And one day they lined him up. They line him up for roll call every day. They lined him up. And the German officer said, "Who here is a mechanic?" And my dad, he looked left, he looked right. Everybody else was looking at each other, timid. Nobody was a mechanic. And so my dad raised his hand. He kind of have an acumen for doing things with his hands and so on. And so he took a chance. And this is one of the themes of his survival. He took a chance many times, volunteering, saying he knew how to do stuff when he didn't, and he did what he had to do to figure it out on the fly. So they said, "Who's a mechanic?" So he raised his hand very timidly. They said, "Come with me." So the officer marched off, and my dad followed, and he brought him to this, like a hut. And it turns out it was a tool shed. And inside of that tool shed was all kinds of mechanical equipment, like for digging and so on and so forth, jackhammers, things like that. And there was a bench to work with tools and parts. And the guy said, pointed to a jackhammer. He said, "This is broken. Fix this jackhammer." So he said, "Okay, I will." So the officer left him alone. It was wonderful just being left alone and not being hounded all day by guards and people beating you, because they were beating them all the time everywhere they went. So he looked around and he noticed in the same shed there was a good jackhammer, a working jackhammer. So he took the one that was broken, and he, as I said, he was kind of a handy kind of a guy, and he was very daring. So he just took this broken jackhammer and he took it all apart into a lot of little pieces, and he laid them out on the table. He did the same thing with the working one, and then he kept looking to compare parts till he saw the part that was not good, that didn't match the good one, So he put that one into the good one, and lo and behold, he fixed it. And thereafter, he worked for a while as a mechanic in this camp.
And I want to bring to the listener, early on, we learned that your father was in construction. So his probably formative years of what you're talking about, fixing jackhammers and probably other things, helped him in his construction career. And that's probably a good bridge of
Absolutely.
to where he became successful in his own right as he moved into the United States and
Right.
eventually over to the West Coast. So I want to ask you, okay, you're growing up in your survivor parents' home. You have a sister. What was it like for you to grow up in a survivor's home?
Well, I knew from a very young age, I knew that we were different. We stood out in a bunch of ways from our neighbors.
In
And
which, in what ways can you?
I'll tell you, in a number of ways. My parents didn't speak good English, they had an accent. They spoke foreign languages at home between themselves. They, I knew that we were Jewish, and all of our friends were also green, which is the Yiddish word greenhorns, new to the US, like greenhorns. And all of their friends were the same kind of people. And we would hang out with those people and go to parties with them and so on. Another thing I noticed that was peculiar to our family and also to all these other families that were our friends, nobody had any grandparents.
Now, what age are you at this time when you're
All the
putting
way
these
from
things?
when I was little, from the earliest of my life,
Okay.
through my growing up. I noticed there were no grandparents, and none of these friends had grandparents. And most of them didn't have any aunts and uncles. It was a very peculiar characteristic of this gang of people.
So you came to San Diego, you were 4
Okay, well, this was even in Connecticut.
in Connecticut too.
Yeah, we had this, it was the same thing there. My parents always hung out with the greenhorn people. And we were friends with them. We'd go to synagogue with them on the high holy days and that sort of thing. So I knew that I was in this special community, a very unique community of people. And my parents were always among them.
And would your sister say the same thing if she was?
I think she would say the same thing. I didn't talk much with her about it, so I really don't know for sure. But I would presume she experienced the same thing. And then we moved to California, and we moved to San Diego, where I grew up the rest of my childhood. And it was the same thing. All the people we hung out with, we went to Bet Jacob Synagogue, a lot of Greenas there, a lot of survivor people and their families there. And we hung out together. And then they had the New Life Club, which my parents belonged to, where we did social things. And then as I became a teenager, all of us kids of these survivors formed the Junior New Life Club to be like for teenagers. We had our parties and our dances and this and that. So I grew up in that environment, surrounded by people that were survivors or second generation survivors.
And so your father, you indicated that your mother didn't speak very much about the Holocaust.
Correct.
But when do you remember the first instance of your father starting to tell you the stories that are contained in your book?
I cannot tell you, I cannot remember the first instance. I can just tell you it goes way back. I was probably on his knee when he was telling me some of these stories. And then as time went on, he would talk about them whenever, very often later on, as I told you, I used to work with him later on in high school and college. I'd go to jobs with him and he'd be driving there and I'd be in the truck with him. And he would start schmoozing about it then. Also, if we were watching like a movie, especially war movies immediately brought memories to him. Or he would see movies like kind of like Ben-Hur, where you'd see, or the 10 Commandments. He'd see people being enslaved and whipped and so on. He says, that's exactly the way it was. That's how it was.
Now, did you see any outward trauma that your parents experienced from the Holocaust?
The only trauma I saw was I would say during Rosh Hashanah, during Yom Kippur in the synagogue. It was a synagogue made up of a lot of survivors and so on. When they had Yizkor, the service to memorialize the dead, the whole place was wailing and emotionally out of control because you had a whole bunch of people with horrible memories and losses that they had to remember.
So let's
Other
take
than that, I would not say there was any particular, although my mother's mental health in later years was not very good, and one might attribute it to those experiences, but I cannot say for sure.
Okay, so how many children do you have?
3.
So if they were here today with us, what would they say about the memories of your parents?
Well, of course, they saw my parents when they were the elderly grandparents kind of thing. And they weren't really around. I wasn't really around them that much when my dad would be telling them some stories, but I found out later that they knew some of these stories, that he must have been talking to them when I wasn't around.
Uh-huh.
So he must have told some of those stories to them also.
And how did you feel about them hearing those stories at those
Very
young
good.
ages?
They need to know. Yeah, they need to
Okay.
know. So, but I was actually surprised that they knew some of these stories, because I wasn't present when he was telling them
Uh-huh.
some of these things. So it must have been when we were visiting them and I was out of the room or whatever. So, but they learned some of these stories.
Or were they
At that
very
time.
close? Were they very close with your parents?
Oh yeah, very close. So,
So
but
I
we
wanted,
only saw them on occasion.
yep. So I want to take you back to another story in the camps. Give us another one of the lucky stories that you wanted to bring forward.
Okay, one time my dad and a bunch of other guys were pushing this big heavy wagon. It was full of potatoes. A wheeled wagon. It's something that normally a horse would pull, but all they had was these grunts, and they're all pushing on this thing, and they're all emaciated and weak and tired and hungry. They could barely push it. My dad said a lot of the guys were just almost being pulled by the wagon and not even pushing on it. But my dad had this very strong work ethic. As I mentioned, he always said, "I got to work with all my might." And not only that, he saw that the Nazis liked that. They liked you when you were like that. So he would be pushing. He was pushing with all of his might, his shoulder against the wagon. And behind them was an SS, with his gun, and he was poking them, jabbing them. Schnell, schnell, quick, quick, mach schnell, hurry up. It was jabbing them to go faster and faster. And for whatever reason, my dad said, this guy was right behind me. He kept poking me the most of everybody. And he started to get worried, because you never want to be singled out. It was a bad sign. If you got singled out for anything, it was a bad sign that they're mad at you or whatever. So he kept jabbing my dad. And then at one point, he grabbed my dad by the shoulder and spun him around to face him eye to eye. And my dad said his heart just went into his throat. He said, "This is it. It's over now." Because they would kill somebody at the slightest provocation. And so he said, "This is it." And the guy opened his trench coat and pulled out a loaf of bread and shoved it under my dad's shirt and spun him back around and went shh, like that. And he said, by the way, this was not a benevolent kind of guy. He said he had seen the same guard do ruthless things to other people, but somehow he had struck a nerve with him that he had admired him for his hard work.
Huh.
So he learned to always volunteer and always work very hard. That endeared you to them, and it kept your chances of living going.
Okay, so you left your parents to go to San Diego. What was it like to actually leave your parents' home? And what did your parents think about you leaving?
No, we all lived together in San Diego.
Okay.
And then and I went to San Diego State College, which is, as I said, a bicycle distance away.
Okay.
So I stayed at home. So all my 4 years of college were at home. And that's where I got my bachelor's. And then I got accepted to Duke.
Okay, so let's take it. When you decided to go to Duke, did they say, why aren't you going to San Diego State for your master's?
No, no, they understood. They understood that I had to go where I was accepted. And I had applied to several places. And one of my professors that I did a senior project for put in a good word for me. He was a Duke man. So they offered me a stipend, paid my tuition, paid for my living. I would be a teaching assistant, a TA. And so I said goodbye, and they understood. I was a grown man.
So when you came home, What was the first thing you looked forward to when you came home to see your parents?
Well, that's it, just to see them. And
Oh, come on. What kind of food? What kind of food? What did you think your mom would make for you when you came home from school?
well, I had one favorite, the treat that she thinks she would make for me, yapzak. I don't know if you ever heard of it.
No.
It's like a potato casserole. That was my favorite. She would make for me sometimes.
Okay, that's cool. And what about what did your father do when you came home?
Oh, he was just happy, and since I was just out of school, I had my master's, but I didn't have a job, so I stayed with them. And then immediately my dad started taking me to work with him. You know, he was doing work and maintaining as a maintenance man for this big building management company. So he started taking me with him, and I could make a few bucks that way. So in the meantime, I was applying for jobs. So for a while, for several months, I worked with him still. And then I finally got a job at Navy Electronics Lab. Started my career as an engineer.
Before you go further, tell us about the DP camps a little bit.
Right. Okay. I'll tell you another little episode leading to it if I could.
Sure.
My dad was in the last camp where he was liberated. And so at that time he had volunteered, as he always did. They asked who's a gardener. He would raise his hand, and he would start doing gardening. So
where was the DP camp?
No, this was still a concentration camp.
Oh, okay.
And then, yeah, I'm telling you, when he got liberated. So then one day, May in 1945, all the guards were gone. Everybody woke up to go to work, and the guards were gone. Nobody took roll, and nobody knew what to do. And they were a little scared, because if they don't go to work, what will happen to them? So my dad also was scared, so he just went out to work. He went out to work anyway. He said some of the people were ridiculing him. Why are you going to work? You know, he was just timid, and he just kept working. And then they looked up in the distance, and lo and behold, coming through the gate was this Jeep with a Russian soldier in it. And the Jeep just busted through the gate and came up to them, and that's when they realized they're now free. And there was just a lone Russian soldier. He came and he said, "You're free." And he said, you could not believe the euphoria of the people. All these emaciated, thin prisoners, they came and they lifted the Jeep up into the air. You know, a whole bunch of them went around the Jeep and they lifted it up into the air out of happiness and joy. And then they pulled the guy out of the Jeep, and they started caressing him, and they touching him and grabbing him, and they actually ripped his clothes. My dad said his clothes were hanging off. His uniform was all torn up. They were so elated. It was uncontrollable joy.
Does your father say what the officer or the soldier said back to them?
No, but he said he understood. He wasn't mad. He understood their joy. And he immediately ordered the kitchen to open. I want the kitchen open, and I wanted cooking food, and everybody go and eat as much as you can. And so they all got liberated that day. And the very first thing they did is they ran over to another camp nearby where the women were, you know, to join with the women. And then a lot of them all ran to a nearby town. And my dad said most of the Germans had already left.
Do you know what camp he was liberated from?
I have to look it up again.
Okay.
It was the Sportschule, the one that ends in Sportschule. Anyway, then he went. So they all ran to this nearby town, and he said everybody started looting the houses, looking for anything that they had, any necessity that they needed, clothes or food.
Are they still in Eastern Poland?
Yeah, they're in Eastern Poland, but again, this is a German area, so there were a lot of German people in this area. But as he said most of the houses were abandoned. The Germans had run away. They were scared of the Russians.
Right.
And then, believe it or not, the Russians came, and they made my dad a policeman. So because I guess they asked around who's trustworthy, who's who's a good guy, you know. So they picked my dad. He became a policeman. And here's another little episode. There was a baker in town, a German guy, who was still baking bread, believe it or not. And and people could come into his town and buy into his store and buy bread. And he said the Russians, he said, were very badly behaved. They would come into his store, just grab the bread and walk out, didn't pay. And you know, they figured hey, these Germans, you know, we're going to teach them a lesson, kind of thing. They've been vanquished and up theirs, kind of thing. And my dad said, even though the guy's a German, my dad still felt bad for him. And not only that, he's not going to keep baking if this keeps happening. He's going to lose money. So he tried to get the soldiers to pay, and he got their officers involved, and they told the soldiers, you got to pay. Don't steal from the guy. And the guy couldn't stop adoring my father. You know, so anyway, so that's one little story. But anyway, at this point, my dad and his buddies, it was only about a week after liberation, and they said, and the Russians were already giving everybody work permits. Said, get ready to get a job and start working again. And my dad and his buddies said, no way, we've just been slaving for all these years, and we're not ready to go back to work yet. And then they had heard stories that just across the border, which was very close, on the American zone, the Americans made a rule, however many years you were in camp, that's how many years the Germans have to support you. Just let's go over there. So he and some buddies that ran across the border, they went to Czechoslovakia, and about a week later they were in Prague. And in fact, I have a picture of my dad. When he got to Prague, he had a picture taken when he was still in his striped uniform, and he still had, okay, oh, here it is. So this is my dad 1 week after liberation.
Wow.
In Prague. He had a picture taken, and notice his haircut. See the stripe down the middle of his head?
Yeah.
Yeah. And this camp, once a month, he said they would come and they would shave a stripe down the middle of your head.
In the concentration camp.
Right. In the concentration camp. And this made you easily recognize if you escaped. And also they say it helped with lice. It made it easier for the lice to be seen and disposed of. So he and his buddies went over there. They were in Prague. And then and by the way, he said, the Czech people, they didn't know how much to treat my dad and his friends. They couldn't, they were tripping over each other to treat them good. He said they put him up in a hotel. They couldn't stop honoring, because they saw them come with their striped uniforms and they knew they were concentration camp survivors. But pretty soon they wanted to go to the American sector. So they kept going. They got into Germany, and they tried to get into the American sector. He says, but this American soldiers didn't want to let them in. They didn't have any paperwork, you know. Plus there were thousands of people, refugees and people all over Europe trying to move from one area to another area, and everybody wanted to get to the American sector. Things were better over there, you know, and so on. So they didn't want to let him in. But lo and behold, some of the American soldiers were Jews, and they heard my father and his buddies talking Yiddish to each other. So they immediately knew these are our people. You know, so and it turns out the commander of the camp of that base was a Jew, and he got my dad and his buddies in. And
another lucky break.
Very lucky. So they befriended them, and they all were helping them. And they said, you know, you got to go to a DP camp. That's where they're going to take care of you. So they brought him over to Bad Reichenhall, which was a deep, which I believe it used to be a resort area in Germany. You know, Bad, it's a baths, you know, for hot baths, that kind of thing.
Right.
But they turned it into a DP camp. And so my dad went there. And in that camp, again, they needed a policeman. They made him a policeman. So he was a policeman in this camp, and he tried helping his people as best he could. He even said he admitted once in a while, he'd see some of them trying to break into a house, to get some goodies, and he would help them out, So he kind of broke the rules a little, but he wanted to help them out. So in this DP camp, one day, they used to have entertainment. They would show movies sometimes, and there was a movie being shown, and people were in line to get to watch the movie. And in this line, he saw this cute girl, and she looked very despondent, and kind of crying. And he said, "What's the matter?" She said, "Look at how long the line is." She says, "I'll never get in. The line is too long. I'm never going to get into the movie." He says, "Come with me." So he took her with him, walked her to the front of the line. No questions asked. He went into the movie, took her to the movie, and that became my mother.
And your mother's name is?
Ruth Shuftan. So.
And she's how old now? She was 15. She's now 18 or 19?
Yeah, she's about 18 and 19. My dad by now is like 21. And so
How long did they spend in the DP camp?
I think they were in there a couple years.
And how did they get to the United States?
Well, after that, as I said, my dad moved to a town, Regen, a nearby German town, where he became a handyman. And I don't know the details of it or how long and so on, but I know that they were married in Regen, and that's where I was born. And that's when my dad started remembering what his Bubbe told him. You're going to go to America, and an uncle is going to greet you there. And it turns out, by the way, he told this story to his parents when he first heard it, when he first heard the vision. And they said, "Forget about it. You don't have any uncles in America." But it turns out my mom had an uncle in America.
Amazing.
So he found out about this, and that probably refreshed him. It's time to go to America. So they were applying and doing what they had to do.
What year were you born?
I was born in 48, and by 1950, we went to America, and lo and behold, as they got off the ship from Ellis Island, they got into New York, and lo and behold, my mom's uncle came, shook my dad's hand, and there was $50 in it.
How did you know?
Huh?
How did he know that the $50?
Maybe my mom told him. Maybe she wrote him a letter that my husband had this dream.
I see.
Maybe. I don't really know. I just know that for my dad, it was the vision coming true.
So what was their experience? Did they tell you anything about their experience of seeing Ellis Island?
Very little. In fact, I didn't even know about that, except I looked it up in records. I found the records of when they landed in the boat that they landed in, and
What boat
my name was there.
what boat did they use?
I couldn't tell you off the top of my head.
Okay.
I'd have to agree. I have a picture of the documents, and they got off. So that's when they landed in Ellis Island, and so that for a while, the Jewish agency was moving people around, and so first for a while they moved them to Chicago, then for a while they moved them to Miami, and I have another little incident about my dad in Miami, if I could. It's kind of a diversion, but
Go ahead.
when he was in Miami, there was still segregation, and this really peeved my dad when he came and he saw, when he's waiting for a bus, that there was a chair for white people and a chair for colored people, and this really made him angry. He had just come out of a camp where people were mistreated because of who they were born, the way they were born, and it really made him upset. So he said from that point on, he always just sat in the colored chair. And then he even got kicked off a few times by cops, but as soon as they left, he went back to the colored chair because it really made it upset him. Anyway, he was in Miami for a short while, and then they heard about friends that they knew. A friend of my mom in camp, a woman living in New Haven, Connecticut, and she said, "Come on down. We got other people here just like us. We'll all join together and we'll live together." So they moved to New Haven, Connecticut. My dad found work in construction, and the rest is history. So.
Okay, so I think we've just come to the episode end for this, the Obligation of Memory podcast for the Jewish Culture and Holocaust Remembrance. We're going to come back and talk about really some interesting details about Iser's writing of his book in the next episode. So come on back and we'll see you soon.